My name is Dr. Karen Philbrick, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. MTI leads the California State University Transportation Consortium, funded by Senate Bill 1 here in the state of California, and the Mineta Consortium for Transportation Mobility, funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. Our mission is to increase mobility for all by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. During today's webinar, if you have any questions for our presenter, you can submit them through the conference chat feature. We are recording this webinar, and the link to view will be available shortly after we conclude on our website as well as on our social media pages. Today's webinar explores how autonomous and automated vehicles, which are both electric and shared, promise to reduce reliance on the personally owned gasoline-powered car. We will learn how policymakers can harness technological innovations that have the potential to make our cities safer, cleaner, more inclusive, and more sustainable, very importantly. On that note, it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. William Billy Riggs. Dr. Riggs is an MTI Research Associate, a professor at the University of San Francisco, and Director of Research for a prominent consulting firm. He conducts research in the areas of autonomy and smart transportation, housing, economics, and urban development. Without further ado, let me turn it to you, Billy. Please take it away.
Thanks, Karen. I really appreciate it. And thanks for everyone who's attending. And for those just joining, this is, really our focus today is on this idea of local policy and automated mobility. And so we did get a handful of questions up front. I've tried to integrate some of them, but I really invite them for the conversation between Karen and I a little later. And again, we've put our, the Mineta social feeds up here, as well as my own social feeds. So feel free to contact us via social, as well as email afterwards if there's anything you'd like to follow up on. So without further ado, this was our outline for today is really to talk about the context for policy in automated and autonomous mobility. Explore what are the policy roles for cities, and provide some simple, and I would say in the spirit of most of my research, practical takeaways for cities. So without further ado, let's really dive into the policy context. And the idea here is not to provide it today in our spirit of research snaps to provide an exhaustive look, but provide an overview of where policy is going. And in full disclosure, this is evolving, particularly those of you in the state of California. You've seen some rulings from the CPUC of late that really will have advanced the way we think about particularly autonomous ride sharing. And I think that that will only accelerate over the coming years, but it will also clarify. So in terms of background, I want to really acknowledge that piece of work and the policy report that is available on the Mineta website, and we will provide that link a little later and in updates to this as this video is posted online. But there's a series of events that this is based on, everything from the Autonomous Vehicles Conference that we host at the University of San Francisco to the work that we've been doing with Planetizen for the last 6 years to do technology benchmarking across the country, as well as many of the folks that have been involved with me with the Autonomous Vehicle Symposium, and that includes folks from Farron Pierce, Nelson Nygaard, Waymo, Cruise, May Mobility, Ford, just to name a few. And so I'm very grateful to that crew. And if you've been involved with any of that, you'll know that a lot of it did look at like physical design and physical transformation of the street. I'm a big, as a designer and planner, that's important. But when we distill back how we operationalize a lot of the things that we want physically in the environment, a lot of it relates to policy. And policy is difficult when there's a lot of uncertainty. And that's what we're facing now, with a lack of understanding about behavior and some hypotheses in terms of where research is anticipating things are going. And so policy has to be nimble and anticipatory, just in terms of what the research is saying, I mean, I think the good thing to say is that right now, I think that we're going to see slow, uncertain, and incremental transitions. I know that my colleagues, Brian Grush and John Niles, talk about this idea of transit leaps. And I think it's to be debated whether or not this idea of dramatic leaps will be the future we'll see, because right now we're seeing more like dribbles in terms of really technological innovation. And some of that is based on how quickly it can accelerate, but also how policy is really not allowing operations to accelerate as much as we think. And we now are in the midst of a pandemic that has slowed things down dramatically. But, I think when we look at this, there's conflicting information out there. I think personal AVs and AV taxis could increase VMT and eliminate parking. We don't know that. There's provocative research out, even December of 2020, that suggests that a total increase in mobility and a total increase in VMT. AVs could increase roadway capacity. Well, some research shows that, and yet some does not. So there's some interesting work out of the Dutch government that says conservative driving algorithms actually reduce freeway capacity, whereas work from UC Davis, and I respect the work very much, that we could achieve 90% efficiency on freeways or 36% efficiency on freeways. I don't think we know that. And so this is where, when we look at like fleet ownership and we look at, shared automated taxis, the potential to reduce VMT, a lot of this stuff does not happen in the absence of good policy. And I would say that right now our policy frameworks and, a lot of the questions that came in earlier are like, how do we deal with preemption? Well, a lot of the policies, yes, are happening at the federal level, the state level with regard to autonomous and automated mobility. We have the AV Start Act. We have the Self-Drive Act, which are providing a framework. Autonomous Vehicles 4.0 is providing primarily guidelines for industry, protecting users and looking at vehicle safety and setting goals of promoting efficient innovation marketplace. But at the end of the day, there's very little direction for local governments, and local governments have been a little in the dark. There are some good case studies out there, for example, with the Portland Savvy Initiative. San Jose, right in Minetta's backyard, has an interesting innovation initiative. City of Boston has some interesting policy on this. But when we did a national survey as a part of our planning technology web business parking study, we found only about 12%, and this is a statistic from last year, had some kind of direction. And this is a lot of the granular data, and we tried to classify a lot of this policy that was happening. A lot of this was happening in smaller cities that were actually looking at white papers and ordinances or mentioning autonomous vehicles in their policies and general plans. So we were seeing a lot of smaller and perhaps I would suggest more nimble communities at least start to mention them in general plan, build in at least some expectation for what a policy standard should be for automated mobility. So we are seeing some policy development. But I would say just right now, the best word we can use is a patchwork. And so in that context, my team and my research team felt like that there was a policy role for local government in this idea of a fragmented patchwork that would bring more consistency, but also when we look at the intent of the AV Start Act, the intent of Autonomous Vehicles 4.0, it is to bring, to help accelerate automation, consistency and reliability is important. So when we think about that, if cities are preempted from many aspects of design, safety, operations, what are the domains that cities can operate? And so when we classified a lot of this policy, there were three clear areas that we thought that based on evaluating these 602 cities and finding roughly 12% of that had policy. The three clear areas are operational and asset management. When we say operational, that can primarily we're referring to speeds, and we say asset management, we're referring to roads as real estate. Looking at pilots and partnerships, and we'll cover a little bit of that today, and just in terms of some examples, and then potentially investing in technology. But the idea of technology does not have to be digital technology. The idea of really investing in physical infrastructure, and as sexy as it is, I always come back to no one ever complained about signs, lines, and potholes that were high quality. So without further ado, let's just dive a little deeper. And if you've had a chance to read the report, in the practical spirit, we really tried to classify our work in terms of this idea of what are low-cost, short-term strategies that cities can focus on. And then as they think longer term, there may be higher cost, longer term things they can work on. And the spirit of this thought, a few years ago, Mark Schlossberg, Adam Miller-Ball, and Elizabeth Shea and I wrote a piece that really challenged this idea of eroding the right-of-way. But the problem is most cities don't have a few $1 million to go out and dig up their roads and make them pedestrian thoroughfares, or dig up their roads and make them these mega pedestrian superblocks similar to what Barcelona has done. So how can we incrementally start with low-cost, big wins that can transform cities and also enable and automate a sustainable and equitable automated future? So let's focus on some of those low-cost, short-term strategies first, and then we'll actually talk about the bigger picture on what cities can be aiming towards. So first off, I really want to emphasize this idea of positive sum roadway designs, and looking at the future of pedestrianizing urban areas and Vision Zero, as well as incorporating electrification. In terms of kind of where we do look at that, I mean, the biggest thing we can look about, and I purposefully chose this beautiful picture of New Orleans during Mardi Gras, because shouldn't every day be Mardi Gras? It's becoming, I think it's becoming more and more common, particularly in European cities, to see pedestrian downtowns or goals of pedestrian downtowns where there's limited mobility. We have seen an aspirational goal, for example, for San Francisco to pedestrianize and look at Market Street, and look at Market Street down, cutting through the center of San Francisco as a pedestrian and cycling zone. So I think there's really an opportunity to think about both pedestrian zones and zero energy zones, as well as to really double down on Vision Zero plans. And I know from interviewing every one of our autonomous vehicle companies, or innovative companies, a lot of the large companies that I've talked to are 100% behind Vision Zero initiatives, and a lot of their technological advances is really looking at narrowing the corner cases for collisions through computerized driving. And so important to emphasize that as a low cost, high impact policy thing that cities can implement now. But also when we think about the zero energy future, our climate goals, and particularly as we see wildfires in California, a need to reinvent our grid, a need to really think about the future of how we power cities, we really have to think about electrification and or other sources of energy in zero emissions transportation zones. There are very tacit things that cities can do in terms of thinking about subsidizing, for example, off-lease vehicles for low-income minority populations. And I talked a little bit about this in the policy document, but a huge opportunity for cities to take a leadership in proliferating electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles down the socioeconomic spectrum. And I think we can dive deeper into that, into questions if we need to. The other thing really is to think about is how can we really reinvent? There's a lot of tension between the Americans with Disabilities Act and many of our electric vehicle charging, much of our electric vehicle charging infrastructure right now. I've written a little bit about this on in a vision statement for the next 10 years on Planet Zen, but a big opportunity for cities to express leadership in electrification really is providing charging infrastructure, requiring it, but also making it accessible to those with individual and unique needs. So at the same time, let's actually then, if we have some low-hanging fruit, I want to focus on, those tacit items to start off with. How do we accelerate further as we look long-term? And I think some of this can be done through planning and planning that we're doing on a very regular basis. But if we're really thinking about implementing the future of curbside pickup and drop off, looking differently at pricing. A lot of questions that came in early were about, how do we think about curbside pricing? How do we think about roadway pricing? What's best practice in that area? Hard to cover that in a high-level policy doc, but I have some ideas there. And but also kind of looking at reinventing and standardizing the right-of-way. So, I think the lowest hanging fruit there is really looking at how do we reimagine the curb? Can we think about different ways of providing signage that's more visible? Can we think about different uses? And I actually would argue, and we talk about a little bit in this document, that we need to think about the use first before we think about the pricing, in terms of having high active use and high turnover on curbs that actually facilitates urban growth, facilitates urban sustainability, and high levels of access for people across the economic spectrum. Big opportunity there to reimagine what the curb looks like, but also to reimagine where the curb is. When we think about pricing, whether or not it's curbs or roadways, there's a paper that I'm happy to provide the link. It's actually under review at TRR right now. We have a working paper version on SSRN that we have that actually even talks about how planners can actually use price anchoring, price norms, social norms to simplify pricing. And I'll just quickly hit on some best practice here, because it was one of the questions, which is the idea that a lot of our pricing initiatives in cities have become very complex. And we've done some work that kind of plays with numbers. And I want to, if I was to emphasize some of the graphics that are in this slide, we've played with anchoring numbers. So if you know anything about price anchoring, there's a reason why when you walk into a store, the high-priced items are in the front of the store and the bargain basement is at the back of the store. You're willing to pay more if you're anchored to higher numbers. And so we've actually shown that this works on modified versions of parking meters. And we've actually worked that, if you go to the far right of this slide, it actually works in people's understanding of complex pricing in terms of monthly versus daily parking. And so we've compared those two in this paper. But I think that the principle there is simple, understandable pricing that is comprehensible is important, but also anchoring to both numbers as well as social norms. So our lessons here: complexity can confound decisions, but you can also, conducting experiments like we've done here is really important. And considering, and I'll just say, social norms are very important. The picture in the center, I always like to refer back to this picture that my friend Denver Agarta from the city of Portland sent me a couple years ago about, there was a neighborhood in city of Portland that decided, hey, our streets aren't priced and they're not very well enforced, but you can get a penalty for parking here, but we're going to be playful about it. And they had a pretty amazing response to just telling people they were going to become bald or kill a unicorn if they parked illegally in a residential neighborhood in this case. And the funny part is that may have actually driven the behavior just as much as the potential fine. So, I want to conclude with this last piece, that I do think that a lot of my work on automated vehicles has really been focused on this idea of rethinking the right-of-way. And as much as we think it's a radical proposal, in the 10-year horizon, if we start eroding the right-of-way and thinking the street is real estate, now we really can start to provide the physical infrastructure that allows for automated operations at the same time, and operations that are safe and slow and sustainable. At the same time as that we are facilitating zero emission travel, and particularly safe travel via walking cycling, and I would say automated transit. Um, I'll just thumb through this. If you have looked through the work that I've done with the Mark Schlossbergen team, it's a little peripheral, but it's very consistent to the policy report that I've released through MTI. But we really talk about these three principles of lane thinning, parking removal, and thinking shared. And then again, if you can start to think radical in terms of the Barcelona example, really start thinking about, well, maybe every other street, if we get to a bicycle, pedestrian, shared autonomous transit future, maybe every other street becomes more a linear park, or it's an opportunity for dense infill housing. Controversial to say in the TRP space, because streets are for mobility, and yet they're maybe streets they're an opportunity to be something more. The last thing that I'll say is that we really are seeing an opportunity with automation, and this is actually not there. We did not cover this that much in the local policy roadmap, and primarily because most local governments jurisdictionally do not have that much control over their local transit or their regional transit, and yet the question that maybe we should be asking is, should we, and should local governments rethink mobility at the local level, and our potential mobility partnership? And I've showed a picture of VIA in Berlin. BVG in Berlin has a really interesting last mile pilot that they've run. This has actually been done, and if you've probably seen, Paul Davis from Lyft talk about their amazing successes in Monrovia, and we featured them, as well as a Go Dublin experiment. Some of these last mile partnerships with rideshare companies really have transformed access for those that do not live within a walkable, bikeable distance to regional rail and high capacity transit lines. So I do think that maybe there is an opportunity for local governments to become service providers by partnering with AV companies. That is likely based on the way in California, at least, based on the way that we are allowing for rideshare experiments that may not be in the 1 to 2 year horizon, that may be in the 3 to 5 year horizon, but I think it's an opportunity that we should start to think about. So last, you saw me snap because this is research snaps. Let's provide some simple takeaways, and then I think we have a bit of time for some questions. Consider multiple users, implications for bikes and pedestrians. Look at sign lines and good pavement to facilitate automation. You have to start thinking about operational asset management, and consider mobility partnerships. So that said, maybe I'll turn off my share. Here's a link. I think we'll make the link available to attendees afterwards. Or maybe we can put the link to the report in the chat as well. But I'll turn it over to Karen, who's here with us on video, maybe to facilitate any discussion or questions.
Excellent, Billy. Thank you so very much. And just because I think I heard this, did you say kill a unicorn or go bald? Was that
yes,
the message?
That's right. If you kill a unicorn or go bald, you're definitely going to prevent somebody from illegally parking. Yeah, there's a whole wealth of social and behavioral norms in the business and marketing world that transportation planners have yet to really capitalize on. And the best example I sometimes provide is that one of the more successful TDM measures at most college campuses of late has been the Earn a Bike program, which was piloted by University of Louisville originally, but has had just amazing success at UCLA. But this is the idea of giving someone something free and seeing what value that has. So I'm a big believer in harnessing the power of behavioral economics in almost everything we do in transportation planning and engineering.
It reminds me how there's a psychological angle to all of our interactions, whether they're personal or professional. So let's get right to the questions because we only have 4 short minutes. But before I do, Brad Flam just shared a very nice compliment on your work, Billy Riggs, and thanked you for your efforts in this regard. First question, are state and local governments staying clear on the difference between A, automated driver assistance in human driving vehicles, and B, No driver at all robo-taxis like Waymo and Cruise and Zoox are developing.
Yeah. So state and local, I think they are, from a policy standpoint, they are drawing a line between ADAS and what we consider, and I don't, robo taxis, I would just say, level 5, level 4, level 5 vehicles rather than robo taxis, because that combines the idea of a ride share with kind of the automation section. But yes, we're trying to make a policy distinction. And I think the big elephant in the room is that Elon Musk keeps on doing more and more to blur the lines between what is ADAS and what is a driving assist system and what is an automated system. And this is where some of those challenges to that norm are providing some confusion. And that will be something that we should probably welcome preemption from federal, state, and local to make that distinction, because the blurrier that line gets, the more dangerous. I think that the driving, that there's a lot of theory about like that handoff being between a driving assist and a fully driven car being the most dangerous condition in terms of reaction time. So
thank you for that. Yes. Let me jump to another important question that was submitted in advance of today's webinar, and that is, other than speed limits and infrastructure technology for bike, ped, micromobility, aren't localities being preempted out of AV regulation by state governments and possibly soon the federal government?
Yeah, I thought about this quite a bit. Yes, there is quite a bit of preemption happening with regard to vehicle operations. But
and Billy, I'm sorry, can you, because we do have a number of people from a broad spectrum on the line, can you just briefly define what preemptive is?
Yeah, I mean, so the simplest way to kind of define preemption is that there's state jurisdictional policy or federal jurisdictional policy that requires local governments to adhere to that policy. And the best example we can cite is what transpired with Uber and Lyft, where Uber asked to be regulated at the state level, and actually we can actually say Lyft is the one who initiated this originally in 2012, initiated state level regulation in many states across the country, and that became the standard, and local governments were required to adhere to that. I could go on, but I want to make sure that I'm giving enough space for other questions.
Yes, thank you. It is 10:29, so we're on to a last question here. It's a quick one, maybe. How soon can we bring automation to public transit, light rail, and our bus systems?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And, I think that some of the self-driving companies would like to accelerate pilots, next year. Some of the question really at this point is regulatory and what cities are willing to tolerate. Again, California and the California Public Utilities Commission have been leading the way. There's some questions right now in terms of how autonomous ride sharing, how autonomous transit will work with SB 743 regulations. Yes. Will they contribute to greenhouse gas emissions? So at this point, some of the tension will be regulatory. And so this is where I do believe partnership is the key. And the challenge with cities, and maybe I'll leave us with this kind of zinger, but also thought, is that many cities feel like they got burned by Uber and Lyft, and because the rollout was so abrupt, it changed transportation overnight. And I think there's a lot of fear by cities across the country that the rollout of automation and automated vehicles will be so abrupt that it will change transportation once again, that it will be just this massive leap. And I think I always say that there are very few moments in time that are extremes. Most of the time, things happen at a more incremental pace. And so, will it be black or white? Will it be heaven or hell? It's more likely to be a shade of gray. And to a certain degree, that the more we facilitate cross-sector public-private partnerships, the smoother those types of rollouts are going to be. And so in this case, I really feel like the more we can have successful pilots and we can facilitate, we can design the future we want to see and design the standards we want to see, the better those operational solutions will be. And the last thing I'll say is, as much as we fear what happened with Uber and Lyft, we would not be having this dialogue today had they not disrupted the situation at that point. So as much as it was painful for cities, it really did change the discussion on what mobility is.
Absolutely. And I'm so disappointed that our time together has come to a close, because this could be a full half-day discussion. It is so provocative and so interesting. And thank you. Thank you for spending time with us today, Dr. Riggs. We're so pleased with your work. And again, to our attendees, we will be sending a video out later today. Thank you for tuning in, and we do hope to see you for our next webinar, Safe Routes to School in 2021. Let's Walk the Walk. That will be on February 16th. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.